Terrifying true stories from neighborhood watch patrols you won't believe. That sentence looks good on a thumbnail. It also happens to be painfully accurate. I've been on more night patrols than I care to admit. Not because I'm a hero, far from it, but because in a neighborhood where people are polite in daylight and oddly quiet after midnight, volunteers end up being the ones left with the phone ringing in the dark. We swapped recipes in the HOA newsletter and warnings in a Facebook group. We traded small-town gossip for incident reports. We brought flashlights and stale coffee and the kind of curiosity that makes you follow another human being down a lamplit street when you probably shouldn't. If you've ever scrolled through a neighborhood watch feed, you know the rhythm. The same 3 people reply to every post. Someone mistakes a raccoon for a bobcat. A driver leaves their hazard lights on in the church lot. And then, once in a while, something happens that rewrites the ordinary. These are those somethings. Before we start, a quick necessary note. One of the incidents involves human remains. I will be restrained and factual in that section, but if the idea of decay or death is upsetting, skip ahead for a few minutes. You've been warned. I'll tell these stories the way they were told to me, by patrol texts at 2 in the morning, by neighbors tapping on my window, by a man with a handkerchief full of snot and sorrow who couldn't look me in the eye. I was sometimes there. Often, I was not. But every single one of these accounts intersects with the neighborhood watch in a way that made a street feel less safe afterward, or made people step beyond polite civility into something heavier: fear, vengeance, grief. The first one begins on a dull October evening. I still remember thinking the whole thing would be a Halloween prank. It started with a post in the Facebook group. Anyone else see an old woman pushing a shopping cart with something in it? The photo attached was grainy, a pale blur under a street lamp, the silhouette of the cart and a hunched figure pushing it, the thing inside wrapped and long. Someone joked prop almost immediately, followed by a pumpkin emoji. Someone else wrote prob dementia, and then James chimed in. James lived 2 houses down from me and had inexplicably a crush on everyone's younger sister. He was the kind of neighbor who'd notice if you left a mug on the curb for 5 minutes. He posted, "I followed her for a bit. She keeps looping the same block. Looks like a coffin, I swear." James was the sort of person you want on a watch for being observant. You do not want him for his penchant for making mountains out of molehills. But he was right about one thing. She was looping. The woman, Ethel, we learned her name by the second night because people are better at telling other people's stories than they are at minding their own business, was small and stooped, and wore a threadbare coat that didn't match the October chill. She pushed a rusted shopping cart. In it was something covered in a stained sheet. At first the loops were every 40 minutes, then every 20. She'd go down Maple, up Elm, past the bakery that had closed years ago, and then start again. Neighbors debated. Halloween enthusiast. Lost in memory. Put her in touch with social services. The Facebook thread ballooned with theories and pity, and the occasional offhand cruelty that people think passes for humor. Netflix is really going for realism this year. We organized a night patrol. Mike, our nominal neighborhood watch lead, the person who printed flyers and assigned rusty orange vests like they were roles in a community play, set a rotation. I took the second shift because I couldn't sleep and because James had asked me to come check it out with him. He sounded nervous on the phone, which is a rare and reliable way to tell someone is telling the truth. We found Ethel just before midnight, under the sodium glow of a street lamp, the cart creaking like a tired animal. She moved slowly, and every time she passed the same crooked porch with the ceramic cat, she adjusted her grip as if the motion mattered. The thing in the cart was obscured by some kind of sheet or blanket. From a distance, it looked like the shape of a small trunk. Up close, it looked like everything that happens when you let loneliness sediment into habit. I want to be careful here. What follows is factual, and I am not dramatizing what a human being looked like when she opened something she carried. If you find images of decay upsetting, take a breath now. She opened it because she thought she had to. Her lips moved. No words that made sense to us. James, behind me, made a sound that was half laugh and half gasp. The top of the cart revealed itself, and a smell hit us, rotting, sour, the kind of odor your brain tries to explain away by blaming garbage. There was the suggestion of a shroud beneath which lay an object the size and shape of a small casket. It was a casket. It was a thing that had been a body. I will not describe the body in detail. The coroner later called it advanced decomposition. That will have to suffice. I will say the sight of it took the breath from us, lodged us in the street like spectators at an ugly moment we could not look away from. James stumbled back. I fumbled for my phone with hands that felt ungloved and called 911 because that is what you do. You call, you tell them exactly what you see, you wait. Police arrived within minutes, though minutes stretched differently in those moments. They set up a perimeter. They were professional and quiet. The coroner's van came with its dull, practical lights. Officers asked us to step back. They asked Ethel her name. She answered with the name of the man in the casket, Clive. Husband, neighbor, deceased years ago, stolen, the story went. Someone in our Facebook group pieced together the rest like a puzzle. A theft from a closed cemetery, an unsolved missing casket report a decade prior. The cemetery had been broken into in 2012. Someone had taken a small coffin used for an infant or for a premature burial, perhaps for parts, perhaps for a horror display. It had vanished. The paper trail dried up. Ethel, she was old enough that memories bent for her into storylines, had been living alone. People said her husband had died in the house years before. They called him Clive, in the whispers we all use to make painful things sound less blunt. Whether she had known the coffin was missing, or whether she had kept a photograph, or whether she believed Clive needed to be with her on the walks, no one could ever truly say. Social services visited afterward. They found her bed unmade, and photographs that were like small flags that marked a life. She was taken to the hospital after the police questioned her. James and I both ended up in the ER for different reasons. Him because he'd inhaled the stench and felt physically dizzy. Me because my hands wouldn't stop shaking and my knees had decided to protest. The doctor gave me something to steady my pulse and made me sip water until I felt present again. The coroner handled the casket with the economy of someone used to the sour side of human life. It is a strange sentence to string together, how we look at the dead like objects sometimes because we are terrified of their history. The police photographed, the forensics logged, and the story moved into the official channels with the slow, glacial motion of bureaucracy. The neighborhood watch message thread went quiet in a way that felt like a held breath. People sent messages of condolences to Ethel, and others sent private messages with a tone that implied they had always known the woman down the street was fragile, unmoored. What changed after that was small and seismic at once. For weeks, people stopped leaving trash at the curb after dusk. The group instituted a new protocol. If anyone saw something remotely odd, call 911 and post a photo. Mike printed a new flyer reminding folks of the county hotline for elderly welfare checks. James stopped being a jokester for a while. He sometimes sat on his porch with a thermos and watched the street as if witnessing a replay. In truth, none of it fixed anything. Ethel never fully recovered, according to the conversations we were allowed to overhear by sympathetic neighbors. She drifted in and out of lucidity, sometimes talking to Clive as if he were still alive. A month after the coffin was found, she died of pneumonia in a care facility. The obituary was tender and careful. Someone brought flowers and left them on her stoop for a day as if performing a ritual that might justify the late-night alarms and the mid-shift adrenaline we had felt. The story left me with questions that lingered like an ache. Where had that coffin come from? Who had taken it and for what? Did someone forget to look for a grieving woman in their neighborhood? The answers were partial, unsatisfying, and filed away with other municipal records. The neighborhood was different. The small complacencies we had allowed, an unlocked gate, a porch light burned out for weeks, shrank a little. If this is the kind of thing that keeps you up, and you want more true neighborhood weirdness, subscribe and send your story to the email in the description. I read everyone. If you thought that was bad, wait until the next one. There it begins, as so many fiery disasters do, with a cigarette dropped like a small careless punctuation at the end of a night. I'll be frank, there's almost nothing more predictable than a group of people drinking on a late summer lawn when one of them discards a cigarette and a hedge catches. What's less predictable is how a small catch turns into a pattern, and how patterns attract the sort of people who are looking for chaos. It was a Tuesday when we noticed smoke rising above the hedgerows between two houses on Larkspur Lane. A couple of college kids had been in the front yard, a cooler and a guitar nearby. Someone had been smoking beside the hedge that divides properties. The embers found tinder. A neighbor with a garden hose did his best. Firefighters arrived and doused the flames. The report came back as accidental. "Be careful," said the watch admin post, the one with red text and earnest civic responsibility. Weeks later, the hedge burned again, not exactly in the same spot, but close enough that people raised an eyebrow. Someone posted a grainy image of a small orange flare climbing a dry shrub. "Flagrant," wrote one commenter. "Arson?" asked another. Most of us shrugged. It's easy to underestimate the escalatory nature of small misdeeds. They beg to be taken seriously, or they invite repetition. In the playing out of those two fires, the neighborhood started to divide. Those who wanted to assume an accidental cause, and those who wanted to assume malice. When heat meets both, it becomes harder to tell the truth. We started to patrol after those two calls. I had the night shift with a woman named Kara, who worked day shift at the library and knew every book by smell. We walked slowly along the hedges and underneath the streetlights. We made note of the areas where the ivy had been stripped and where the mulch looked exposed. Mike put out a notice to everyone. "If you see loitering after dark, call 911 immediately. Do not confront." That line, "do not confront," was more important than anyone could guess. The escalation wasn't immediate in the sense of weeks. It was immediate in the sense of inevitability. One night, late, I smelled it before I saw it. The particular sweet, acrid tang of something burning that isn't just a barbecue. Smoke curling low near the ground. I had been halfway down an alley when I heard it. A soft pop, like the snap of a brittle plant. I moved toward the sound and saw light kissing the eaves of a shed at the end of a neighbor's yard. The shed that sat behind a house with a battered swing and a dog-eared American flag. You do not expect a shed to be a thunderhead until it is. One second you see a patch of orange behind the lattice. The next second there's a crack that runs through the night like a judgment. There were noises, sharp explosive pops that suggested pressurized cans inside the shed. I cannot tell you how they were set afire, only that a shed full of common maintenance items became, in the span of a breath, a furnace. The response was chaotic and human. I remember the dog barking like a thing trying to come back from sleep. I remember a neighbor who'd been watering his lawn charge out in slippers with a garden hose and then stop because the flames were too hot. I remember the sound a wall of flame makes when it remembers its own size. I remember thinking, stupidly, that I could get closer to see whether anyone was inside. The rule in the Facebook group is to avoid heroics. The rule in the brain in the moment is to sprint. I did neither. I moved too quickly to be cautious, too slowly to be useful. The air in front of me shimmered. A blast of heat hit like a fist. There was a pop, then a louder pop, the kind that makes your fillings ache, and a spray of black sparks that rained down like an obscene confetti. For a second, everything was light. I smelled metal and something floral, like a can of spray that had burst. Firefighters arrived with the kind of swiftness that makes you grateful in a religious way. They dropped lines, they barked orders. Water met flame in a way that made steam and the smell of scorching plastic. I found myself coughing, an animal reflex. Someone handed me a mask. Someone told me to step back. The man who'd been watering his lawn earlier looked at me with eyes I didn't recognize. "They did this on purpose," he said, but he said it like a man making an observation rather than an accusation. An investigation followed, of course. The police asked neighbors for surveillance footage, for any pattern of people seen loitering near the property. Someone noted a suspicious car that had been buzzing the cul-de-sac at odd hours. Someone else noted that the fires seemed to happen on nights when the watch had fewer active volunteers. Motive is a fragile thing in such cases. Sometimes it's stupidity, sometimes it's revenge. Sometimes it's a dare that got too real. We clutched at hypotheses like life preservers. After that night, the group instituted new rules about reporting and staggered patrols. We replaced porch lights. I bought a better flashlight that fit into my palm like a baton. Mike suggested a neighborhood safety seminar sponsored by the township. There was an undercurrent, an uneasy sense that someone in our midst wanted to torch ordinary things, to make us feel smaller and more brittle. We were warned to call the non-emergency line for suspicious activity and 911 for anything that was actually happening. A few weeks after the shed, there was an explosion that I will not describe in forensic detail because it doesn't help and can invite the wrong sort of curiosity. I will say this: an old junk car that had been abandoned for months on a nearby side street, nicknamed Christine by a bored kid on our block, was set alight and blew into an astonishing, stomach-curdling bloom of heat and glass. The blast sent shards into a yard where someone had left lawn chairs, and we spent nights sweeping plastic and glass until our hands smarted. No one was injured, and the police reported arson. But while the car exploded in a flash and the fire brigade did its job, the psychological explosion lasted. The idea that our streets could host arsonists who felt little consequence knotted through the neighborhood like a thread. People started to lock their gates even during the day. A woman I knew who'd always left her porch light on to read at night suddenly bought blackout curtains. The watch page filled with more than recommendations. It filled with a low-grade anxiety. We all wanted to be vigilant in the abstract: the safety pamphlet, the recommended smoke alarms, the hotline numbers. But in the concrete, in the endless small decisions of living, allowing kids to play after dusk, letting your elderly neighbor use the back step for a cigarette, it all compressed into little acts of risk assessment. I remember a particular night when we almost lost someone. I was on patrol with Devon, a small man with a loud laugh and an aversion to authority. He insisted he could smell something different from a mile away. He wasn't wrong. He sniffed and then scolded himself for doing that. We threaded between hedges and came upon a back alley where a shed wall was disintegrating and licking at the night. Flames were hungry and clever. They find a gap and use it as a hinge. I won't tell you the rest of that night, because the rest of that night is one of the moments I can't shake, and because I promised we would leave some arcs unresolved. We called 911 and waited. And in that waiting, I realized how much weight you put into a number on a phone screen. As the smoke thickened, I thought of the woman with the shopping cart and the way habit can disguise grief. I thought of Clive wherever he had been laid, and the way a single act, an arson here, a theft there, could rearrange an entire block's faith in safety. When the fire brigade finally arrived, they moved with a business-like precision that made you trust human institutions again. They asked us when we'd seen anyone suspicious last. They asked if there were other incidents we'd reported. We gave them everything we had: grainy video, shaky eyewitness reports, a list of suspicious cars. They thanked us with the sort of stern warmth that says, "We do our job and we need your eyes, but we will handle the dangerous bits." We slept badly for a while. The hedges were pruned, the charred mulch hauled away, yet the sense of being watched by someone whose idea of entertainment included small fires lingered like a bad perfume. What I learned then was that danger in a neighborhood often arrives incrementally, as if someone were turning up the volume on a song that began as a distant hiss. But that volume came with other stranger notes. Not all dangers wear familiar clothes. Some walk on two legs and carry pets that look like they escaped from a documentary about ancient swamps. It was around the time the hedges burned that the watch message lit up with a post that read like a joke from a comic strip. "Has anyone seen a man walking an alligator near the canal?" The poster added a blurry picture, an elongated head near a leash-like rope. We all laughed at first, because laugh we did. Then someone else replied, "Not funny, just saw him around dusk." The laughter thinned. Warren, as he was eventually called in the threads, was a presence who moved like he'd been built from bone and river. He had a tapered face, a baseball cap with no team, and the way you do if you want to be noticed, he walked the same route most nights. The animal on the end of the rope was juvenile, a small alligator that, despite public imagination, was not the monstrous thing of the movies, but a heavy, scaled animal with a curious eye. A lot of people reacted with instantaneous panic. Others reacted with a baffled, civic-minded urge to call animal control. I saw him once while running my route. He was late, dusk-slicked, and the alligator, nicknamed Princess by someone who later posted that they were trying to be kind, dragged along like an object waiting to be returned. Warren nodded to me. I nodded back, as everyone does in neighborhoods where you swap grocery store recommendations and avoid true personal inquiries. He did not look like a predator. He looked like a man with a skill set that had gone sideways. We notified the non-emergency line and also texted 911 because the animal looked dangerous to some residents, especially families with small children. Police came, animal control came, and the situation became a standoff of sorts. A grim public scene that felt like an argument over what counts as normal in a world already frayed by small conflagrations. What happened next, how the papers phrased it, how the Watch recounted it, has its own strange cadence. There were threats hurled by someone who thought he was protecting the neighborhood and vulnerability from Warren, who had a record, one the Watch dug into because that is what we did. We sniffed out backstories like ferrets. Someone said he'd once worked at a zoo. Someone else said that was a rumor. The standoff lasted hours. Animal control negotiated, gently coaxing a creature that did not understand the human concept of shame. The alligator was eventually secured and taken to a sanctuary that specialized in reptiles. Warren was arrested for multiple alleged violations, not because he had intentionally endangered the public. He told anyone who would listen, but because he had a way of living that made others uncomfortable. He would later be described in memorial posts as a man who loved creatures and misread boundaries. That's not an ending. It's an episode. And some endings are merely transitions to other questions. What do we owe people who walk at the edges? What do we owe animals that are, in our eyes, monstrous or majestic? The Watch had done what we'd said we'd do. We called the authorities and let them handle a dangerous situation. The moral arithmetic looked clean, but the aftermath felt messy. Some neighbors cheered quietly at the removal of a perceived threat. Others sent messages of grief for both the man and the creature. The sanctuary posted photos of Princess curled in a heat lamp, eyes closed in something resembling peace. Warren died a year later, of a thing that seemed as ordinary as a failure to breathe well at night. People attached small tributes to that death in the comments, sometimes the same people who had called for his arrest. It was one of those nights that reminded me how neighborhood watches can be a kind of theatrical apparatus. We dress in vests, we patrol, we report. We comfort and accuse in the same breath. We are both guardian and jury, often while the real judgment is in the hands of police, courts and social services. By then our little group had built habits. We had the caffeine and the spare batteries, and the group chat that chimed at odd hours. We had an instinctive distrust of normalcy. If you live in a place long enough, you develop a map of the ways people can hurt or help one another. The map is not neutral. It's stitched together with rumor and fear and the occasional act of real kindness. There were more stories. Christine, the abandoned car, continued to sit on the corner like a bored sentinel, until it did not. There was the Watch that turned inward and oppressive, the kind where pamphlets and anonymous notes did more harm than good. But those are for later in the night, later in the telling. For now I'll leave you with the residue of those first events. The woman who walked with her past folded in a cart, the hedges that caught flame like dry tongues, and the man who walked an alligator down a suburban canal. They are different kinds of wrongness. Grief turned private and then public, negligence that slides into malice, and a life that intersects the community in a way that makes neighbors wring their hands and call for order. If you're still with me, know this. Neighborhood watches can be a shield. They can also be a mirror that reveals uncomfortable things about the people who live behind front doors. Sometimes the Watch sees trouble and reports it, and good things happen. Sometimes the Watch sees trouble and amplifies it, turning suspicion into ostracism. The line is thin. We walked it on more than one occasion. There's another thing people don't talk enough about, the after effects. Patrols leave impressions on all of us that do not stop at the edge of the cul-de-sac. I keep seeing the lantern glow in my head from the night at Ethel's. I still flinch when I smell scorched wood in late summer. And when I hear the word coffin in a casual way, it rings in me like something not meant to be joked about. People talk about the adrenaline, but the long tail is quieter. Nights where you wonder whether you can sleep if you leave the front light on. Afternoons where you wonder whether your civic involvement did more harm than good. There are more tales, and some of them get darker. Stories about vandalism that becomes pyrotechnic, about a watch group that turned from neighborly to hostile, and about mysteries that police files never solved. On some nights, I dream about answers that aren't there, and wake with my phone buzzing with a neighbor's text, asking whether they should approach someone asking for money on their porch. Tonight, before I tell you about Christine and the watch that became a thing of menace, I'm going to step back to the point where the shed fire had just taken hold, and the fire brigade was on the way. I remember the heat pressing at the back of our necks, the way the firefighters shouted orders into mouths full of smoke, and the private, ridiculous hope that in a world of small cruelties, there would be an institution that would cut the noise down to size. The rest of that night and the threads that led to the car are tangled. They involve questions we were not yet ready to ask about motive and ownership, and whether a society that leaves people to their own devices sometimes creates the very emergencies it fears. They involve names I have altered, and details I will not publish because people deserve the dignity of anonymity when suspicion plants its seeds. So I'll stop here for a moment, with the smell of char and the echo of a siren still in the air, and with a line of thought that wants to keep unspooling. How does a community decide who is protected and who is watched? How close is the neighborly glance to a glare? How much of safety is comfort, literal porch lights and locked doors, and how much is the risky moral labor of seeing a person and deciding to help rather than to judge? There is more. The car burned. Someone got hurt. The watch wrote angry emails. People left and people doubled down. The neighborhood, like any organism, tried to heal in the only ways it knew how, by policing itself and by pretending some things were accidents. But sometimes accidents are the beginning of something deliberate, and sometimes deliberate acts are made ordinary by our unwillingness to name them. I'll pick up the thread with Christine and the escalating campaign of vandalism that followed next, and with a watch that stopped being about safety and began being about exclusion. There are letters that arrived, pamphlets that appeared on doormats, and a confrontation with a man who believed surveillance was a religion. The ledger of those events is uneven. Some entries are crime reports, some are whispered regrets. When you patrol a neighborhood at night, you learn that darkness has a way of revealing rather than hiding what we already were. For now, breathe. If any of this has hit you hard, step away, get some air, and remember there are people you can call if you're rattled by these stories. We'll continue. When I say Christine had been a fixture on our corner, I mean it in the way folks mean when they describe an empty chair at a family table, present, awkward, and carrying a history you don't quite want to unpack. She was a late-model sedan, hood caved in on one side, a windshield spider-webbed like frost, one headlight dim as an afterthought. Someone had left her there months before I moved in. She gathered flyers and rain and the odd stray cat. Kids named her Christine because nobody could be bothered to remember a plate number. Kids do that. People rename objects so they feel less like evidence. At first, the attention to Christine was petty and suburban. Someone keyed her door, someone egged her, someone left a cheeky note calling her an eyesore. We laughed it off in the group chat as classic mischief. Then she became a ritual. Every few weeks, a new violation. A window smashed, a tire slashed, graffiti that read like the half-formed thought of a bored vandal. Each post pulled in commentary, sympathy, moral outrage, the inevitable request for surveillance footage. Mike would pin the thread and remind everyone to lock their cars, to report suspicious loitering, to take down anything that could be used as cover. There was a pattern to those small acts if you looked for it. The attacks almost always happened on nights with little moon, when the cul-de-sac felt roomy and private. They clustered around the same 2-week blocks when patrol numbers dipped. People began to joke about Christine's bad luck. Jokes are how communities cope until they stop being funny. That is when you begin to feel the hair rise at the back of your neck. One night, a week after the shed explosion, I was awake and restless and scrolling the watch feed because you do that now. It's an extension of your nervous system. Someone posted a shaky video shot from a porch across the way. Christine sat under a streetlight, one of her doors ajar, a shadow moving like a slow animal by the rear bumper. The comments came fast. "Is someone in there?" "Call it in." Someone posted a time-stamped screenshot. The watch organized a small response. 2 cars to circle the block, flashlights and a careful approach to not spook anyone inside. I drove. Mike drove. Devon drove. Devon's laugh still sounded like he was up to something, which made it harder to read him those nights. We arrived to find a crowd of neighbors pressed into doorways, their silhouettes like a congregation of people waiting for a miracle or a verdict. Christine's interior glowed orange. It looked almost warm, as if someone had left a candle burning for a ghost. Then the smell hit. Hot plastic, melting vinyl. Someone said gas, and the word moved through us like a warning. We kept our distance, because that's what police briefings teach you. Stay back, keep a line of sight, call 911. The dispatcher told us they had units en route, keep safe. We waited, and then the car erupted. I've seen fireworks, stovetop flares, the burst of an overripe melon. None of those comparisons do that moment justice. The explosion was a bloom of sound and heat that inverted the night. A chunk of bumper flew like a slow meteor and landed 30 feet away in a neighbor's rhododendron. The glass exploded into $100 confetti that glittered in the air and then rained down. The streetlights flickered from the pressure wave. For an absurd fraction of a second, the neighborhood looked like a theater set. Flames, smoke, the odd automatic motion of a lawn chair spinning in the blast wave. It ended as quickly as it started. Firefighters arrived and moved with practiced calm. No one from our little crowd was injured, mercifully. There were no heroes, only people who had been in the wrong place with bodies still deciding whether to tremble. The police cordoned off the block. They took statements. They told us it was arson, as they were permitted to say in those first moments. Investigation ongoing, they said, which is the adult way of giving you nothing while buying time. What I remember more than the flash was the silence after. The civic, embarrassed quiet that hangs when something that belongs to no one and everyone has been trashed beyond recognition. Christine had been a repository of contempt and neglect. The explosion felt like the boil had been lanced. People came out the next morning to sweep up glass. Folks whispered about motive like they were rehearsing accusations in the mirror. A few people floated theories. Kids from a neighboring district, local punks, someone cleaning up an insurance drama gone awry. No one offered proof. Someone posted a grainy frame captured by a door camera showing a pair of figures moving quickly away. Nothing definitive. The police asked for any footage, and we gave them what we had. Doorbell cams, security cams, the scrape of a Fitbit geotag. They followed leads that snaked into other neighborhoods. They arrested no one. The prosecution stalled because evidence does that. Slides like oil off a stained pan when the case would prefer to stick. The arson was, legally speaking, unresolved. It taught us not to expect tidy, moral endings. For months afterward, Christine's corner felt like a liminal place. People avoided driving past at night. A woman who ran early every morning rerouted her loop. Teenagers used the burned footprint as a dare spot. Mike, whose sense of order had always nestled in clipboard schedules, organized a rotating watch near the corner until satiated curiosity and the indifferent law of life moved people to other worries. It was a strange, small victory. More eyes meant fewer nights of vandalism, but it also meant patrols that felt less like community care and more like a vigil for a body without a name. From petty vandalism to full-on arson, the arc tastes familiar. Small harms allowed to breathe grow into something that can hurt. But smaller, subtler harms have their own danger. They begin as passive aggression and metastasize into active exclusion. Our neighborhood watch, which had started as a group of misfits who handed out flashlight batteries, slowly developed a faction that saw suspicion itself as a civic virtue. At first it was pamphlets, suggestions about security, tips for staying aware. Then it changed tone. The pamphlets arrived in mailboxes, typed, neat, printed on quality paper that gave their contents a false authority. They warned about foreign patterns and non-compliant behavior, using language designed to sound reasonable until you read it more than once. Anonymous leaflets began to appear on stoops, lists of local trouble spots with names circled. The watch page started to host posts that advocated for keeping our streets ours, with a picture of a gate and a quote from a founding father. You could argue the typography was neutral. You could not deny the intentions hiding between the lines. Samuel emerged as the fulcrum for that side of things. He'd been on the board since the page began and had a way of speaking in absolutes that made people either nod or fold. He'd been a security consultant of sorts, or so he liked to say. He organized patrols with a military precision, Boot schedules, a rotation chart, a set of acceptable encounters that read like an orientation packet for suspicion. Samuel's charisma was the kind that made rules feel like virtues. That charisma is how these things start, the zeal made to look like concern. At first, people liked having someone who could mobilize. It feels good to have a captain in a storm. But then his language in group posts shifted from preventive to punitive. He began posting reports that linked mundane behavior to criminality. Kids loitering near mailboxes were recast as fences for stolen goods. A man who mowed his grass at midnight was implied to be hiding something. The Watch's moderation policy blurred. Complaints were amplified into dossiers. If you had the misfortune of falling under Samuel's attention, the Watch could become less of a safety net and more of a magnifying glass. Devon, who'd done many of the patrols with me, who loved bad puns and had an unfortunate habit of humming during stakeouts, got caught in Samuel's orbit in the worst way. Devon kept to himself in small ways. He ran a little garage service from his driveway. He painted murals on reclaimed wood and refused to attend HOA meetings for reasons of principle. Samuel labeled him eccentric in a post and then questionable in a direct message. Someone anonymously left a pamphlet about chemical smells at Devon's doorstep. Someone else left an accusation in the Watch group alleging he ran a possible meth lab. The message was blunt and bordered on slander. We called the police when the allegation appeared online because that's what responsible community members do. The police sent a unit who, after a polite search and a more polite conversation, found nothing illegal. Devon shook his head and laughed once, hard and brittle, and said he didn't want to be drawn into a fight with neighbors. "I've got 2 kids," he told me later, his voice low. "They're small. I don't want them to wake up to some drama." Even without legal charges, the stigma worked like salt. People began to avoid Devon. Invitations to neighborhood barbecues slowed to polite refusals. He took fewer night patrols. The Watch that had once included him became, in effect, an excommunication. The group that once recommended baking soda for odors now circulated rumors as if they were facts. The online feed hardened from civic solace into something more tribal. Then came the anonymous notes. Handwritten, they'd appear in mail slots and on the soles of shoes, threats thinly veiled as warnings. "We look out for our own," one read. A flaming hedgerow showed up one night near the property of a family who'd recently moved in from another state. No one could prove the Watch's faction had been involved. We can show correlations and timing and escalating rhetoric, but causation is where law and moral accountability must tread carefully. The arson was reported as always. The fire brigade extinguished it. The police collected statements. The Watch's page filled with empathy posts and healthy debate, and then, inevitably, 2 factions. Elijah, an elderly volunteer who'd been with the Watch since its birth, started sending letters to people he considered disruptive. He was a small man, with a shock of white hair, who believed in order as an ethical posture. His notes began like old men's opinions about lawn etiquette and morphed into thinly veiled admonishments about community standards. He left a note at my house once about the way I parked my truck. Complaint number 3, he wrote, and signed it with his name and the phrase, "keeping us safe." I played his note to a tune of exasperation and mailed back a polite reply. "Thanks, Elijah. Parking's on the list." What worried me was not Elijah's tone, which was irritatingly officious, but the way his small acts gave cover to anonymous cruelty. The pamphlets acquired an imprimatur when someone as respected as Elijah seemed to endorse the Watch's tougher posture. People started to feel they had permission. Permission is a dangerous currency. It purchases the things we've been taught to distrust about ourselves. The crescendo came one late autumn, when my own mailbox was scrawled with accusations accusing me of being uncooperative and unsafe. I had done nothing more than post a thread warning people to keep their cameras on after dark. It was a low, nasty thing to feel targeted by neighbors you played softball with in summer. I took it to the police, who advised documenting everything and keeping calm. They couldn't stop words. They could, at best, log them and perhaps detect a pattern later. But the harm had already spread. You cannot unring a bell, and suspicion once sown takes root where forgiveness used to grow. The last night I felt comfortable in that house was the night a hedge along the property line nearest to my porch burned. It had been a small fire contained to 3 feet of shrubbery, but there was something performative about it, as if a line had been struck on a map. We called firefighters. They came. The investigation suggested accelerant, as reported in the watch thread, but again the case languished. No arrests, no vindication, just a new layer of fear. I confronted Samuel about the tenor of the posts and the way his rhetoric seemed to encourage escalation. It began civilly, 2 men in the municipal library's meeting room with coffee and printed posts. Samuel listened, then smiled the smile of a man who'd rehearsed indistinguishable answers. "We're trying to protect the neighborhood," he said. "Some people don't appreciate that." He used the word "we" as if it were a sword and a shield at once. It was a disorienting conversation because his words were half true. The group had provided safety in small, undeniable ways, but the question that sat heavy on the table was whether the guard could become the jailer. The conversation didn't change his mind. He folded his arms and told me that people needed to be reminded what belonged to the neighborhood, and he gave examples. Laundry hung openly, guests who parked erratically, people who walked in unfamiliar ways. He insisted his actions were defensive. He said things I'd come to recognize as a kind of civic absolutism, the idea that belonging could be policed into being. There are societies in which belonging is manufactured through exclusion. I was seeing that happen on a micro scale. After Elijah's death the next month, old age, a quiet passing, nothing criminal, some of the harassment abated for reasons I couldn't name, except that death has an authority that rumor cannot override. His funeral was attended by the faction that had supported him and by the people he'd criticized. They stood together like soldiers at a wake. There was a reconciliation in the sense that people were quieter. Grief tends to mute the louder instincts. But the underlying architecture of suspicion remained. It had installed wiring inside people's routines. I moved a few months later, not because of a single event, but because the aggregate weight of small anxieties had begun to tilt my life. I didn't want to be the sort of person who counted threats before breakfast. I liked my porch light and my guitars and my tea kettle. I liked the illusion of a small domestic life that didn't require being on guard. We sold the house to a young couple who didn't ask many questions about the neighborhood's past. They brought a dog and a fog of optimism with them. Perhaps they'll be luckier than I was. What stayed behind, beyond the burned shrubs and slope of gossip, was the question I'd been carrying since Ethel's cart and Clive's coffin. How do communities protect without persecuting? Watching people who were, in theory, on the same side, begin to use their collective muscle against one of their own was a lesson in how quickly good intentions can calcify into something brittle and cruel. There are practical lessons in all of this. Call the authorities when you should. Do not confront violent people. Keep a camera where you are permitted. But there are less tidy lessons too. Being watchful is not the same as being compassionate. Holding suspicion as a default posture makes human beings into projects rather than persons. That is the most corrosive thing I observed. Neighbors who became auditors of each other's lives, measuring compliance like currency. Not every member of that vigilante-leaning clique was cruel. Some were sincere and exhausted. A few were people who'd been victims of true crime and who'd never recovered their sense of agency. Trauma gives some people a hunger to control their environment. Control can harden into targeting. The point isn't to caricature everyone on one side. It's to show how easily a group with good intentions can morph into an instrument of harm when it stops asking the person in front of it whether they are okay, and instead asks whether they belong. What haunts me now isn't the vanity of making Facebook posts or the thrill of a late-night patrol. It's the collateral human cost. Ethel wandered with a coffin because someone once decided it was okay to take another person's grief and make a spectacle of it. Christine exploded because neglect and contempt found a combustible moment. Devon lost neighbors because rumor blew up faster than evidence. Warren and Princess both paid costs that never fit neatly onto our moral ledger. And for every dramatic scene there are 100 quieter ones. People who stopped answering the door. Parents who didn't let their kids play in the street after dusk. Old men who muttered complaints into a world that had stopped answering back kindly. The reason I tell these stories without a revenge narrative is because life rarely gives you one. Mostly it offers you a long series of small reckonings and the chance to choose empathy or suspicion. And that choosing matters. It matters because our civic fixtures, police, animal control, social services, do heavy lifting, but they rely on us to be witnesses who report, not persecutors who decide guilt in comment threads. Our role should be to notice and to refer, not to convict from our porches. I still hear from people who were in the threads. Sometimes they want closure that the legal system can't provide. Sometimes they want to know if I'm still on patrol. Occasionally, someone writes to tell me a small update. The sanctuary that took Princess sent a holiday photo. Devon's kids started soccer and wave to strangers now. Christine's corner has a bench and a memorial plant where people leave stones. These are the small redemptions that make the rest bearable. Other notes are darker. Someone who once stood with us now lives elsewhere because whispers chased them away. Another neighbor refused to return to their house after a note showed up on their door. It's a steady ledger of small losses. Neighborhood watches can save lives. Call it when you see smoke, when you suspect a dangerous animal, when you find something that should not be there. But they can also be the mechanism through which communities police identities, and that is where we must be careful. If you do decide to start or join a neighborhood watch, keep a few principles in mind. Be humble, be accountable, and center the dignity of the people you are watching over. Take your pulse before you post. Ask whether your response helps or harms. Insist on transparency and clear lines to law enforcement. And for the love of common decency, do not circulate unverified allegations. Rumor is the most effective arsonist of all. It can burn reputations in a way firefighters can never repair. There is also the psychological cost to consider. Patrols exact a small psychic toll. You learn to sleep with one ear open to distant engines. You find yourself calculating risk where none used to be. You imagine the worst in the absent silhouettes, because imagination is eager, and the human brain loves a completed story. The tale of trauma in a neighborhood is rarely dramatic. It is persistent. People develop hypervigilant habits and then blame themselves for feeling unsafe in a place they once loved. That is its own form of loss. I do not offer solutions grander than a plea. Let us be careful with one another. Let us not hand the tools of suspicion to those who would use them as clubs. Let us remember that protecting people means protecting their right to live without being surveilled into exile. It also means calling emergency services when necessary and trusting experts to do their dangerous work. Those institutions are imperfect, but we worsen the world when we pretend to replace them with rumor and pamphlets. As for me, I still walk sometimes, not as often as I used to. I keep a flashlight in my kitchen drawer and a small journal where I write the names of people who were kind to me on bad nights and the names of those who were not to punish or boast, but to remember that neighborhoods are made of choices. I keep a copy of Elijah's polite note pinned to a box, the handwriting looped and earnest, and I think about mercy. I look after the new couple's dog when they travel. I volunteer at the local community center, where I try to teach young folks how to use a camera, to bear witness responsibly, not as an instrument of rumor. In the end, what terrifies me most is not the alligator I once saw being walked on a leash, or the shed that nearly took a life, or the cart that carried names better left in peace. What terrifies me is the subtle way a neighborhood can turn on itself, how people can mistake vigilance for virtue and in the process make a living place into a tribunal. We like clean stories, evil confronted, villain punished, good restored. Real life rarely offers that mercy. Mostly it asks us to decide again and again what kind of neighbors we want to be. If any of these stories has unsettled you, take a moment, step outside, turn on a porch light, call someone you trust. If you have a story like this, if your neighborhood has an odd corner or an unexplained thread, send it to the email in the description. I read everyone, and sometimes, if the story is right for the channel, I pass it along with names changed. If you'd like to support the work that lets me dig into these odd corners, there's a link to the Patreon in the description as well. It helps with legal checks, research, and keeping lights on long enough to answer a 2 a.m. text. I am still haunted by the things we found on patrol, and by the choices we made in response. I cannot always say we made the right ones. What I can say is this: Community is not safety in and of itself. Safety is made by rules and systems and by the hard practice of treating others with dignity, even when suspicion seems like a shortcut to safety. That work is small, slow, and often thankless. But it's also the only thing that keeps neighborhoods from becoming battlegrounds. You might think your block is immune to such strangeness, that your watch is only a place for shared recipes and lost dog posters. I used to think that too. Then I learned that terror doesn't announce itself politely. It slips in, takes root under small acts, and blooms when we let rumor outpace care. So keep your lights on, keep your cameras on when warranted, call the professionals when you need to. And for the love of neighborliness, give people the benefit of decency until there's a reason not to. Tonight, when you lock your door, maybe let your last thought be less a tally of who might harm you, and more a small plan for how you might help someone else. It is a tiny, stubborn antidote to the worst impulses I've seen on patrol. It won't stop every bad thing from happening. It won't make every mystery have an ending. But it will on the nights when the wind is sharp and the phone buzzes in the dark. Remind you that the best neighborhood watch is one that watches out for humanity first. Thank you for staying with me through these neighborhoods and nights. If you have a story to tell, send it in. If you want to support longer investigations and more of these compilations, check the Patreon link. I'll be back with more true accounts of what people found when they stepped into the dark to see what was happening on their street. Until then, keep your porch light on and your hands steady.